If one day you look up at the sky and realize this familiar world is silently changing before your eyes. At first, no one was worried because everything still seemed almost normal. Only the air became strangely heavier. The ground was still hot, the wind still dry, but in the far horizon, the sky began to hold something unusual. No warning, no clear signs, only a prolonged silence, as if nature was waiting for something. Then on the horizon, clouds began to appear, small and far, but enough to change the light. They grew larger and thicker, blocking the light, turning the sky into a heavy layer of pressure. The air changed, the wind grew stronger, and the sky began to tremble with an invisible tension. A flash of lightning tore across the sky, a first signal of something bigger coming. The ground absorbed the water immediately, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. More raindrops appeared, more frequent, more regular, and the sky seemed to have made a decision. The light faded, darkness spread, and the rain became clearer in space. Water began to flow in small streams, winding through the cracks, gradually changing the structure of the dry ground. They grew larger and thicker, blocking the light, turning the sky into a heavy layer of pressure. Lightning appeared continuously, flashing and fading, making the world unstable and unpredictable. Time passed, but the rain continued, without stopping, without any pause. Day followed night, and night followed day, but the sky only repeated a single movement. Seasons changed, but the rain did not change, as if the climate had entered another state. The ground began to deform, softening, eroding, and everything gradually realized this change was irreversible. And then, people realized this was no longer a rain, but the beginning of a completely new era. Before the rain started, Earth was a completely different world, where dry heat dominated almost the entire surface. There were no vast green forests, no regular rain, only dry land, hot wind, and sparse life. The supercontinent Pangaea connected all lands, making the interior far from the ocean and almost receiving no moisture. Geographical distance prevented water vapor from the ocean from penetrating deep into the mainland, creating prolonged droughts. By day, the ground absorbed intense heat, temperatures rose high, and by night, heat dissipated quickly, making the environment harsh. Life still existed, but did not flourish. Only well-adapted species could maintain long-term existence. Ancient reptiles and amphibians existed, but were limited by scarce water sources and harsh, dry environments. Dinosaurs had appeared, but were small, weak, and had not played an important role in the ecosystem at that time. The ecosystem existed in a fragile state of balance, where every factor depended closely on environmental conditions. There were no clear signs of a major event about to happen. Everything still went on according to familiar rules. But deep beneath the surface, silent changes began to take place, beyond the observation of any creature. Geological processes began to accumulate invisible energy, but enough to change the entire planet. Heat increased, gases formed, and pressure continued to build, approaching an uncontrollable point. All was hidden beneath the quiet surface, where life above had no idea of what was coming. No warning, no signal, only time passing like any other day, maintaining a familiar calm. But the planet was preparing for an event that would change the climate and life in ways never seen before. An event big enough to break the fragile balance that had existed for millions of years before. All creatures, big or small, were approaching a turning point they could not perceive. A change that did not come from the sky, but started from deep within this planet, where everything was accumulating. And when it began, this hot, dry world would no longer be as before, opening a chain of unstoppable changes. The ecosystem at that time was not chaotic, but existed in a very fragile and easily broken balance. Each species had its own place, closely dependent on water, temperature, and the harsh surrounding environment. Just a small change in climate, this balance could be disrupted, leading to unpredictable consequences. Water was the most important factor, and any change related to water could affect the entire ecosystem. When water was scarce, competition increased, forcing species to adapt or disappear from their habitat. The food chain existed, but was not complex, and easily affected by the smallest changes in the environment. There was no abundance, no absolute stability, only a balance always pushed to the limit. Dinosaurs were not yet the dominant species. They existed on the margins, adapting but not yet truly exploding. Larger species dominated, but depended more on the environment, making them vulnerable when conditions changed. This balance existed for a long time, enough to create a stable but unsustainable ecosystem. There were no clear signs of collapse, but foundational elements were gradually approaching their limit of tolerance. Everything still functioned, but there was no room for error, and the ecosystem became more sensitive than ever. A small change in water, temperature, or atmosphere could create a domino effect across the entire ecosystem. And when those changes accumulated, the ecosystem would no longer be able to maintain its original balance. This fragility was not easily recognized, but decided how the entire system would react when an event occurred. When one factor changed strongly enough, the entire ecosystem would be dragged along, unable to stand still. That is the law of nature, where balance is not a fixed state, but a constantly changing process. And right in this fragile state, a major event was approaching, enough to disrupt the entire system. An event that would not only change the environment, but also shape the entire evolutionary process of life. And when it happened, this fragile balance would disappear, paving the way for a completely new era. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, silent changes began, where heat and pressure accumulated beyond stable limits. No one on the surface realized, but below, the planet was preparing for an event that could change the entire climate. Magma began to move more strongly, carrying huge heat and gases compressed in the Earth for a long time. Pressure accumulated gradually, layers of rock were stretched, and the first cracks began to appear in the planet's heart. This was not a single eruption, but a series of prolonged volcanic activities on a global scale. Hotspots formed, where magma found its way to the surface, breaking the Earth's crust from within. When pressure exceeded the threshold, the crust could no longer hold, and the first eruptions began to appear. Lava flowed out, gases and ash were shot into the atmosphere, creating the first changes in air composition. Carbon dioxide and other gases were released in huge amounts, starting to change the global climate balance. The sky began to retain more heat, causing global temperatures to rise and changing climate cycles. Rising temperatures led to stronger evaporation. Oceans released more water vapor into the atmosphere. The amount of water vapor accumulated gradually, making the atmosphere thicker and retaining more energy. The combination of heat and water vapor began to create a completely new climate cycle. A chain reaction began, where each factor interacted, amplifying the change across the planet. These changes did not happen overnight. but were strong enough to push the climate out of its original balance. The climate system began to destabilize, and new conditions gradually formed on a global scale. The first clouds formed thicker, retaining water vapor and preparing for a completely different phase. This was not just a temporary change, but the beginning of a climate cycle lasting millions of years. A cycle long enough to completely change the habitat and how life existed on this planet. And right from these eruptions, the rain that lasted for millions of years began to form. The first rains appeared very light, almost harmless, but they carried signs of an irreversible change. Initially, the ground only received a few sparse drops, as if this planet still did not understand what was coming. But then the raindrops appeared more regular, denser, and the sky gradually closed over the dry land. The light began to fade, the air became colder, and each dry, cracked piece of land began to darken with water. Water seeped into the smallest cracks, touching surfaces that had been dry for a very long time. The first streams formed small and weak, but enough to signal that the ground structure was beginning to change. In low-lying areas, water began to accumulate, reflecting the heavy gray sky, and clouds continued to thicken. The rain was not yet violent, but its rhythm had changed. More regular, surer, like a decision. The sparse vegetation began to react. Patches of green changed color slightly, as if life recognized a new opportunity. The smallest creatures felt the first change. They moved more cautiously in a changing environment. The air became thicker, more humid, and the smell of wet earth seemed to begin to cover the entire old world.
Rains repeated many times, gradually erasing the feeling that this was just a short phenomenon that would pass.
The ground began to soften, the edges of old cracks collapsed, and the first signs of erosion appeared clearer. Small streams connected, creating new flow networks on the surface that used to be absolutely dry. From here, rain was no longer a strange event, but began to become a familiar state of the sky. The change was slow, but clear enough for every creature to adjust how they survived day by day. The old dry heat had not completely disappeared, but it was gradually retreating before a wetter world. The clouds now did not just come and go. They stayed longer, lower, and heavier than before. The climate cycle had begun to turn, and each new rain was connecting into a new era. This was only the beginning, but Earth had crossed the old boundary and could not return. But then, the rain did not stop, silently lasting from one season to another. Days passed in regular rain, and the sky seemed to have forgotten how to return to the clear state before. When one rain weakened, another came, connecting into a chain with almost no pause. The ground had no time to dry. Water piled on water, turning familiar lands into a different face. Small streams were now stronger, deeper, and began to cut into the terrain like very slow knives. In low-lying areas, water accumulated for a long time, gradually expanding into temporary lakes, then swallowing old paths. The space became humid, heavy to the point that every movement seemed to slow down under a low, blurry sky. Sunlight still existed somewhere above, but below, the world was left with only cold gray tones. Creatures accustomed to dry environments began to struggle, as their environment was changing faster than instinct could adapt. With each new rainy day, the old life retreated another step, giving way to completely different survival rules. The ground softened, slopes slid down, and small changes initially now became clear damage on the landscape. The rain no longer carried a strange feeling. but became the default background of a transitioning world. Time began to be measured by the accumulated water, by the disappearing lands, no longer by sun and dry. From a climate phenomenon, rain gradually became a geological force, enough to rewrite the planet's surface. Old migration paths were cut off. Places once safe now became muddy, deep, and unpredictable. Not just one region, but the entire planet was gradually covered by the persistent, cold rhythm of water. Then weeks turned to months, months to years, and the rain was still there, as if it never intended to end. It was that persistence that was most terrifying, as it eroded any chance of returning to the old state. The dry world of before had not completely disappeared, but it was gradually sinking under a new climate order. And by this time, anyone could understand that the rain was no longer temporary, but an era. When the rain lasted too long, water began to stay, spread, and occupy the Earth's surface. Low-lying lands were submerged first, turning into vast swamps, where land and water were no longer clearly separated. Old rivers swelled, changed direction, then overflowed, rewriting the terrain map with a completely new order. Slopes once stable began to collapse, dragging soil and rock with water, deforming the landscape day by day. Water seeped into every space, filling cracks, hollows, and lowlands that once only existed in dry seasons. The ground lost its old shape, as mud and erosion together rewrote the structure of an entire region. Places once safe paths now turned into deep swamps, making movement slow and dangerous. Many creatures were forced to leave their familiar territories, but the further they went, the more flooded areas they met. Not only did water rise, but the air also became humid, making the world look covered by a cold layer. Forests began to change. Trees reacted to the new moisture, while many old species were no longer suitable. The food chain was gradually skewed as habitats changed, food sources moved, and old survival rhythms lost balance. Some species could still adapt, but many others began to weaken because they lost the environment they depended on. Water now was not just an environmental factor, but had become the dominant force, deciding where life remained. Highlands became rare temporary shelters, but they were increasingly isolated amidst the expanding sea of water. Each new rain expanded the flooded area, erasing another part of the old terrain from the planet's memory. Changes, once slow, were now big enough for any creature to feel with every step. The dry world of before was being replaced by a soft, wet, heavy, and increasingly unpredictable planet. When water stayed too long, it began to strip away every anchor that the old ecosystem once depended on. And in that process, a silent purge began, not sudden, but strong enough to change the history of life. From here, the rain did not just flood the world, but was preparing to wipe out species that could not adapt. When the environment changed, life did not collapse all at once, but began to fracture along small links. Species closely dependent on the old environment were the first to be damaged, even if they once dominated. It was not the strongest that disappeared first, but the ones no longer suitable for the planet's new rhythm. Habitats disappeared, migration paths were cut off, and food sources gradually left the areas that once supported them. Each small change itself was not enough to destroy, but when piled up, they became an unbearable pressure. Many species began to weaken silently, not by a big sudden collapse, but by prolonged exhaustion over time. The ecosystem did not explode in a moment. It lost balance slowly, then eliminated the weakest links. Biological gaps began to appear when one species disappeared and nothing filled its place. That is how extinction happens most of the time. Not noisy, but enough to redirect history. When one species was lost, others were also dragged along. Because no ecosystem exists independently, the food chain fractured from bottom to top, making even large and once most stable species gradually shake. Water did not directly kill everything, but it changed every condition, leaving old life with no place to stand.
In a new world, old advantages suddenly became burdens, and many species could not turn in time.
The purge took place without bias, only keeping what was still suitable for the constantly changing environment. And it was that prolonged selection that emptied many positions once occupied for millions of years. An old world was gradually retreating, not only in terrain shape, but also in the order of life. Creatures that once dominated were no longer sure, while smaller species began to step into those gaps.